the moment Ruby Wainwright stepped off the westbound train in Abilene, Kansas. Her boot heel cracked clean through a rotted board on the platform, and she thought, not for the first time, that the West had absolutely no interest in making things easy for anyone. She wrenched her foot free with a grunt, straightened her traveling coat, which had seen better days somewhere around St. Louis, and looked out across the wide, sun-hammered main street of Abilene as though she owned every inch of it. The year was 1873, and the cattle town was heaving with cowboys fresh off the Kishom Trail, dust-coated merchants, and the particular kind of noise that only a place still deciding what it wanted to be could produce. Ruby was 40 years old, widowed for 3 of those years, and she had come from Boston with 2 leather trunks, a sewing kit the size of a small suitcase, and a deed to a piece of land in Colorado Territory that her late husband Gerald had purchased sight unseen from a railroad agent who had almost certainly been lying about at least half of its virtues. She had been told the land was fertile. She had been told there was a creek. She had been told the nearest town was a reasonable distance. She had not been told that getting there would require another 2 weeks of travel through country that had no particular interest in keeping her alive. Her friend Harriet, back in Boston, had wept when Ruby announced she was going. Her sister-in-law had called it reckless. Her neighbor, a kind enough man named Mr. Aldrich, had pulled her aside at the going-away, gathering that Harriet had insisted on throwing, and told her in a low, solemn voice that no woman her age should be doing such a thing alone. She had thanked him for his concern, shaken his hand, and then quietly resolved never to think about his opinion again. She had crossed New York to Chicago by rail, Chicago to Kansas City by a second train that smelled powerfully of livestock, and something else she had chosen not to investigate. And now here she was in Abilene, where she needed to secure a wagon, supplies, a horse or 2, and ideally some kind of guide who knew the route to the Colorado Territory well enough to get her there without killing either of them in the process. The livery stable was the logical first stop. She hefted one of her trunks. A boy of perhaps 12 materialized from nowhere and grabbed the other without being asked, giving her an expectant look, and she tipped him a coin she could not entirely afford and made her way down the main street with her chin level and her eyes taking in everything. Abilene in the summer of 1873 was a town caught between 2 identities. The cattle trade had made it wealthy and violent in equal measure, but the town's more respectable citizens were increasingly tired of the violence and were doing their considerable best to push the cattle trade further south. The result was a town full of contradictions, fine new wooden buildings going up alongside gambling dens, church ladies moving purposefully down the same boardwalk as men who had clearly not slept indoors in months. Ruby found it exhilarating in a way she had not entirely anticipated. The livery was at the far end of the main street, which meant she walked the entire length of it, and she was aware of more than a few pairs of eyes tracking her progress. A woman traveling alone, clearly not from anywhere near here, carrying herself like she had somewhere important to be. She was an unusual enough sight to attract notice. She was not bothered by it. She had spent 20 years being invisible in Boston drawing rooms, the quiet wife of a respectable insurance man, and she had discovered in the 3 years since Gerald's death that she had strong feelings about never being invisible again. The livery stable was dim and smelled of hay and horses in a way that Ruby found surprisingly comforting. She had grown up partly on a farm in Vermont before her family moved to Boston, and the smell of horses was one of those things that lived deep enough in the memory to feel like coming home. "I need to speak with someone about purchasing a wagon and a horse," she said to the interior of the stable in general, because she could not immediately locate a person. A voice came from somewhere in the back. "Wagon's extra. Horse depends on what you need it for." "Pulling the wagon," Ruby said, "and I'd appreciate it if you came out here so I could speak to you properly." There was a pause, and then a man ducked out from behind a stall partition and straightened up, and Ruby Wainwright, who had not looked at a man with anything other than practical assessment in 3 years, found herself briefly at a complete loss. Jacob Winslow was not a traditionally handsome man in the way that the dime novels made their heroes handsome. He was broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested he had done actual physical work for most of his life, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a jaw that was currently carrying about 3 days of growth. His eyes were a particular shade of brown that was almost amber in the dusty light filtering through the stable's high windows, and he was looking at her with an expression that was neither dismissive nor particularly surprised, just attentive, in a way that was somehow more disconcerting than either of those other options. He was, she would later estimate, somewhere in his mid-40s. There were lines at the corners of his eyes and a scar along his left jawline that she decided she was not going to ask about for a considerable length of time. "Where are you headed?" he said by way of greeting. "Colorado Territory. I have a land deed for a parcel about 15 miles northwest of the settlement at Pueblo." He looked at her for a moment. "That's 2 weeks' travel from here, rough country." "I'm aware. You going alone?" "That's my current plan, yes." He leaned against the stall partition and crossed his arms, and she had the distinct impression that he was thinking rather than stalling. "Road's reasonable as far as the Arkansas River crossing. After that it gets complicated. You know how to handle horses. I grew up on a farm in Vermont." "That's not the same as the Arkansas River crossing in summer." "No," she agreed. "It's not. Which is why I'm looking for a capable horse and a well-built wagon, and also, if you happen to know anyone who is making that journey and wouldn't object to company, I'd consider that information worth paying for." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the same general direction. "I might know someone," he said. "Yourself?" Asked because she was 40 years old and had stopped pretending not to notice the obvious. "I've got business in Pueblo," he said. "Been putting off the trip, might as well go." "What kind of business?" "I'm a horse trader by trade," he said. "I've got a string of 5 horses I need to deliver to a rancher outside Pueblo by the end of August. I was going to take the Santa Fe Trail connection and hire on a hand, but a hand's harder to find than it used to be." He paused. "I'm Jacob Winslow." "Ruby Wainwright," she said, and offered her hand in the manner of someone who had decided long ago that shaking hands was a more honest greeting than a curtsy. He took it, and his grip was firm without being performative about it, which she appreciated. "You came from back east," he said. "It was not a question." "Boston. My late husband purchased the land as an investment. He died 3 years ago. I've decided to see what I actually own. Just see it. Live on it," she said, "if it's what the deed says it is." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is revising something he assumed about a person. "All right, Mrs. Wainwright. Here's what I'd propose. I've got a good wagon, it's mine, I use it for the horse strings. You buy the supplies and contribute to the food costs on the trail, and I'll get you to within sight of Pueblo. From there you'd need someone local to show you to your land parcel specifically." "That sounds fair," she said. "When do you leave?" "Day after tomorrow. I need to sort the horses and get the wagon wheels reset. One of them's been giving me trouble." "I'll need 2 days to resupply anyway," she said. "I've been on a train for 11 days and I would like to sleep in an actual bed at least once before I sleep on the ground for 2 weeks." He almost smiled again. "The drover's cottage has rooms. It's the best in town, noisy but clean." "Thank you," she said. "I'll call on you tomorrow afternoon to discuss the route in more detail if that's agreeable." "I'll be here," he said. She walked back to the main street with the careful, deliberate step of someone who is very aware that they are being watched and has absolutely no intention of showing that their heart is doing something unexpected and slightly alarming in their chest. The room at the drover's cottage was, as promised, noisy but clean, and Ruby sat on the edge of the bed that first evening and wrote a long letter to her friend Harriet. She described the train journey, the platform board she had nearly broken her ankle on, the cattle town and its contradictions. She described, with considerable precision, the livery stable and its proprietor. She wrote, "I have found a guide. He is a horse trader named Jacob Winslow. He knows the country, and he was not condescending about my ability to undertake the journey, which is more than I can say for every man I have encountered since I left Boston. He seems practical and decent. I think we will travel well together." She reread that last sentence 3 times before she folded the letter and decided she was not going to change it. The following morning she went to the general store and spent 2 careful hours acquiring supplies: dried beans, salt pork, hardtack, coffee, a quantity of dried fruit that she told herself was practical and not at all a small luxury, medical supplies, matches, candles, and a good wool blanket to supplement the one she had brought from Boston. The man behind the counter, a stout fellow named Peters, asked her 3 times where her husband was, and each time she told him she was traveling alone, and each time he looked at her as though she had said something faintly incomprehensible. In the afternoon she returned to the livery as planned, and found Jacob Winslow crouched beside the wheel of a weather-worn but solid-looking wagon, running his hands along the spoke assembly with an attention she recognized as genuine expertise. "You know horses and wagons," she observed, coming to stand near him. "Born to it," he said, glancing up. "My father was a farrier in Ohio. I started training horses when I was 14. Been doing it ever since." He stood, brushing dust from his knees. "I want to show you the route." He had a map hand-drawn, she noticed, not a printed one, which meant he had made it himself or received it from someone who had traveled this specific route. He spread it on a barrel top and walked her through it. The crossing of the Arkansas River, which would be the critical challenge depending on summer water levels, then the gradual climb into the higher country toward Pueblo, the places where water could be found, the places where the road became difficult, the point at which they might encounter other travelers on the well-used portions of the route. She asked good questions, and she could tell he noticed. "You've been studying," he said, after she asked a particularly specific question about the river crossing technique. "I bought a book in Kansas City," she said, "about overland travel in the southwestern territories. It was written in 1869, so some of it may be out of date, but the geography doesn't change." He looked at her with that amber-brown gaze that she was already finding somewhat difficult to look away from. "Most people who come out here from the East don't prepare like that. Most people who come out here from the East are men who assume someone else will have prepared," she said pleasantly. "I don't have that option, so I prepare myself." The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair point," he said. They spoke for another hour, working through the logistics with a thoroughness that Ruby found genuinely satisfying. It had been a long time since she had planned something of this scale, and she had forgotten how much she liked it, the fitting together of pieces, the anticipation of problems, the particular pleasure of a well-organized list. As she was preparing to leave, he said, "There's a decent eating house 2 streets over. Not fancy. Good food. If you haven't found anywhere to eat." She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that was entirely level and entirely unreadable, and she decided that she would either eat alone in her room or she would say yes, and eating alone in her room was something she had done rather a lot of for the past 3 years. "What time?" she said. 6 o'clock, he said. "I'll come by the drover's cottage." The eating house was called Farley's, and it was exactly as advertised, not fancy, but the beef stew was good and the cornbread was excellent, and Jacob Winslow turned out to be, over a meal, the kind of person who asked questions and then actually listened to the answers. He asked about Boston, and she told him about it honestly, including the parts that had made her feel small and invisible and restless, in a way she hadn't had words for until Gerald died, and she was suddenly free to feel the full weight of it. He did not say that was sad, or suggest she must have been happy really, or offer any of the comfortable dismissals she had become accustomed to from people who found her restlessness unsettling. He said, "So you've been wanting to go somewhere for a long time." "I didn't know that until I was able to," she said. "That's the trouble with wanting things that seem impossible. You don't always recognize them as wants." They just feel like a kind of low-grade dissatisfaction that you tell yourself is ordinary. And now I know what it is, she said, and I'm going. He turned his coffee cup between his hands, and she noticed his hands again, capable, scarred in small ways, the hands of someone who worked with them every day. My wife died 6 years ago, he said. Fever. We had a daughter. She's grown now, married to a farmer in Kansas. I stayed here because the work was here, but He stopped. Low-grade dissatisfied, Ruby offered. He looked up, and this time he did actually smile, and it transformed his face in a way that was not entirely fair, she thought, on a man who was already doing entirely too much damage to her equilibrium. Something like that, he said. They walked back to the drover's cottage in the warm summer evening, and the town was still loud around them, but it felt, in that particular moment, like background noise. 6 in the morning, day after tomorrow, he said, at the hotel door. I'll be ready, she said. She was ready at 5:45 because she was always early when she was nervous, and she was not about to examine too closely what she was nervous about. They left Abilene as the sun was still low and orange on the horizon, the wagon loaded, and the string of 5 horses trailing behind on a long lead, the 2 of them on the wagon seat with enough space between them that it was clearly deliberate and enough awareness of that space that it was equally clearly not quite enough. The horses were beautiful 3 sorrels, a gray, and a black with a white blaze that Ruby found herself looking at most often. She asked about them as they rolled west, and Jacob talked about horses the way some people talked about music, with a kind of fluency and love that was entirely unself-conscious, and she listened and asked more questions, and found that the miles were passing without her noticing. By midday they were well out of Abilene, the flat Kansas land stretching in every direction under a sky that was genuinely enormous. She had not been prepared for the sky, she realized. In Boston, there were always buildings, trees, the accumulated geography of a long-settled place cutting the sky into manageable portions. Out here it was simply everything, and it pressed down on you and lifted you up simultaneously in a way that made her chest feel too full. You're looking at the sky, Jacob said. I've never seen this much of it at once, she said. You get used to it. I don't want to get used to it, she said firmly. I want to keep noticing it. He looked at her sideways, and she could feel it even though she was still looking at the sky. They made camp that first evening by a creek, working with a comfortable efficiency that surprised her a little. She had assumed there would be some negotiation over tasks, some awkward choreography of 2 strangers sharing a camp, but he set up the picket line for the horses without needing direction, and she got the fire going and the coffee on without needing help. And by the time the beans were cooking, they had settled into a rhythm that felt strangely natural. You camp well for someone from Boston, he said. I told you I grew up on a farm. Vermont farm's not the same as Kansas plain. The basic logic is the same, she said. You need shelter, fire, water, food. The specifics change, but the logic doesn't. He was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee. The fire crackled and the horses moved gently on the picket line, and somewhere in the dark beyond camp, a night bird was calling. Why didn't you remarry? He asked. It was direct enough that it caught her slightly off guard, but she had the sense that he was a man who asked the questions he actually wanted answers to rather than the ones convention suggested. I had 20 years of being Gerald Wainwright's wife, she said. Which was not he was a decent man, and I was not unhappy exactly, but I was not particularly myself either. After he died, I found out what it felt like to make every decision alone, and I discovered that I was rather good at it, and I enjoyed it more than I expected to. I wasn't willing to give that up for just anyone. Just anyone, he repeated, with an inflection she chose not to analyze. The land was the first thing I decided for myself in 20 years, she said. I'm going to it first. Everything else can wait. He nodded, as though this was entirely sensible, which she appreciated enormously. The second day was harder. A long, hot pull across country that offered no shade and a headwind that covered everything in a fine grit she could feel between her teeth. But Jacob knew where the water was, a spring about 2 miles off the main track that she would never have found alone, and they watered the horses and refilled their canteens and ate dried fruit in the shade of the wagon, and the afternoon was almost pleasant. He told her about his daughter, whose name was Clara, who had married a wheat farmer named Donahue and was expecting her second child. He spoke about Clara with a warmth that made Ruby like him considerably more. There was no ambivalence in it, no qualification, just straightforward pride and love. She told him about her own brother Thomas, who had stayed in Vermont and run the family farm and was the person she was most sorry to leave, though he had understood. "Thomas came to see me off at the Boston station," she said. "He stood on the platform and he looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, 'You should have done this years ago.' And then he waved goodbye, and I cried for the first 2 hours on the train and felt better than I had in years." "Because he was right," Jacob said. "Because he was right," she agreed. On the fourth day they hit a problem, as the country had apparently decided they were getting along too smoothly and needed complicating. One of the sorrel mares developed a stone bruise that Jacob discovered during the morning check, and she could not be pushed. They would need to slow down and let the lead horses take more of the work while the mare walked easy. Ruby watched him examine the horse's hoof with the same focused attention she had noticed in the livery stable, his hands gentle and certain. He rigged a temporary pad from a piece of leather he had in his kit, and the mare, who had been pulling her head and sidestepping with discomfort, settled under his hands with a visible relief that was almost human in its quality. "She'll be all right," he said. "We'll lose a day, maybe a day and a half." "That's fine," Ruby said. He looked up from where he was crouched beside the horse. "You're not worried about the schedule." "I don't have a schedule," she said. "I have a destination. The schedule is entirely negotiable." Something in his face loosened slightly, as though he had been half expecting her to be difficult about it. She had a sense that he was revising something again, some expectation he had been carrying about Eastern women, or possibly about people in general, and she found that she was pleased to be the reason for the revision. They made a slower camp that day, halfway to where Jacob had planned to stop, in a hollow with good grass for the horses and a view back east that showed the sky stacked with clouds building toward a summer storm that stayed on the horizon and never came closer. She was writing in her journal. She had kept a journal since she was 20, and it was the most private thing she owned, when he came and sat at the other side of the fire with his own coffee and looked out at the horizon. "Tell me about the land," he said. "What you know about it." She told him what was on the deed, and what the railroad agent had claimed, and what she thought was probably true versus probably salesmanship. He listened and occasionally asked good questions, practical ones, the questions of someone who understood land and what it needed and what it could offer. "If the creek's real, it's worth a great deal," he said. "Water's everything out here." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm going to see it in person before I believe it. And if it's not what the deed says, then I'll figure out what it is and decide what to do with it," she said. "I'm not going back to Boston regardless." He looked at her over the fire, and the light was orange on his face, and the shadows made him look like something from an old painting, and she realized, with the specific clarity that comes when you stop being surprised by a feeling and simply acknowledge it, that she was falling in love with this man. She did not say so. She wrote it in her journal later, when he had turned in for the night, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than usual. The Arkansas River crossing came on the 9th day, and it was everything Jacob had said it would be. The river was running high for summer unusual, he said. They must have had heavy rain up in the mountains, and the ford he had been planning to use was clearly too deep for the wagon. They spent the better part of a morning scouting up and downstream for a better crossing, and Ruby did not suggest that he was wrong about anything, and he did not suggest that she wait on the bank while he figured it out, and they found a shallower crossing about a mile upstream by working together, she on foot on one bank and he riding the black horse to check depth. "It's passable," he called across the water, which was making enough noise that she had to read his lips as much as hear him. "Then let's pass it," she called back. The crossing was the most frightening 20 minutes she had experienced since leaving Boston, and she had experienced several frightening things since leaving Boston. The water came up to the wagon floor, cold enough to take her breath, and the current pushed at the wheels with a persistence that felt malevolent, and the horses were strong but straining, and she sat on the seat with the reins Jacob had handed her, and held them exactly as he had instructed, and did not look down at the brown rushing water, and kept her eyes on the far bank, which was coming closer with an agonizing slowness. They came out on the far bank in a wash of water and noise and shaking horses, and Jacob was off the seat before the wheels had fully stopped, checking the horses and the wagon and the loads, and then he turned to her, and she was already climbing down on the other side, her legs quite unsteady, and they met at the front of the wagon between the dripping horses. "Well done," he said, and it was said with a directness and a genuine quality that she felt more than she heard. "The horses did the hard part," she said. "They did, but you held the reins and didn't panic, and that mattered." He paused. "Most people panic." "I was extremely frightened," she said with complete honesty. There is apparently a difference between being frightened and panicking. He looked at her for a moment in that way he had, that attentive way that made her feel entirely seen, and then he said, "Let's get the horses dried off and walk them a bit before we camp." And she nodded and turned to the nearest horse and began rubbing it down with a dry cloth from the supply box, and they worked side by side in the afternoon sun, drying horses and checking equipment, and her heart was still going at some considerable speed. Partly from the river, and partly from something else entirely. They camped on the far bank that night, and there was a quality to the air. They were higher now, perceptibly, the mountains beginning to show on the western horizon as a dark, jagged line against the evening sky that was different from the Kansas plain. Cleaner, cooler, with a sharpness that made her feel more awake than she had been in years. Over the fire, he said, "Everyone back east said you were brave to do this alone." She looked at him. "People kept saying that, yes. I got rather tired of it, frankly. Because brave implies it's dangerous and foolhardy," she said. "As though the only correct response to the situation is fear, and anything other than fear must be bravery. But I'm not brave. I just thought it through carefully and decided it was the right thing to do." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'd say you're also right." She looked at him, and something in his face was so completely, openly sincere that she had to look away for a moment at the fire. "Being brave and being right aren't mutually exclusive," she said when she had collected herself. "No," he agreed, "but most people who called you brave probably only meant it as a way of also saying they thought you were making a mistake." She laughed, a genuine laugh, surprised out of her. "That is exactly right," she said. "That is precisely what they meant, brave and also reckless, brave and also sad, brave and also alone and probably going to regret this." She shook her head. "You're the first person who has said the word right." He met her eyes, and the fire was between them, and the stars were extraordinary up here, and there was a silence that was not empty at all. "I've been watching you for 9 days," he said. "You know what you want. You prepared for this. You can read a map and cross a river and keep your head when things go wrong. You made the right decision." "Thank you," she said, and her voice was lower than she had intended. "I'm not saying it to be kind," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "That's exactly why it means something." The next 3 days brought them into the higher country, and the landscape changed in ways that kept catching Ruby entirely off guard. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, and then to land that folded and lifted in spectacular formations, red rock and sage, and the distant white shoulders of mountains she had only seen in drawings. She wrote in her journal every evening, and still felt that the words were not keeping up with what her eyes were taking in. Jacob told her about the Ute people whose territory this had long been, and he spoke of it with a respect that she appreciated and that she sensed was genuine rather than performed. He had traded horses with Ute riders more than once, he said, and had a considerable respect for their horsemanship. "This land has been traveled for thousands of years," he said. The trails were on, a lot of them started as Ute routes. The settlers came later and used the same paths and called them new, which is not entirely honest. No, she agreed. It's not. She thought about the land deed in her bag, and the weight of what ownership meant out here, and decided it was something she needed to think about carefully and not pretend was simple. They met other travelers on the third day past the Arkansas, a family in 2 wagons heading south toward New Mexico, the parents exhausted and the children wild with road energy, and they stopped and shared coffee and information about road conditions ahead. The wife, a woman named Martha Cleary, looked at Ruby and Jacob with undisguised assessment and then grinned at Ruby in a way that was both knowing and encouraging, and Ruby found herself flushing slightly, which was irritating. "Your husband knows his way around a campsite," Martha Cleary said to her with no particular emphasis that was still somehow entirely emphatic. Ruby began. "He's excellent company," she finished, and Martha Cleary grinned wider. That evening when she told Jacob about it, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "What did you say?" "I said you were excellent company." He looked into his coffee. "And is that true?" "Yes," she said plainly. He looked up, and there was something in his expression she had not quite seen there before, something more open, more uncertain, more nakedly hopeful than his usual careful steadiness. And she thought, with a clarity that was almost frightening, that she needed to say something or the moment would pass and become one of the long, regretted ones. "Jacob," she said. "Ruby," he said at almost the same moment, and they both stopped. She said, "I am going to say something that may make the next few days of travel awkward, and I apologize in advance, but I find that I am not capable of not saying it." He waited. "I have thought for several days that I might be falling in love with you," she said. "I am not the kind of woman who falls easily or frequently or without careful consideration, and I want you to know that I have considered it carefully, and I have also been somewhat annoyed by it because I came out here to start my own life, not to complicate it immediately, and yet here we are." He looked at her for a moment that lasted rather longer than a moment. Then he said, "I have been trying to figure out how to tell you something similar since the day you walked into my stable and asked where I was and told me to come out here and speak to you properly." Her breath caught, just slightly. "Since the first day. Since approximately the first hour," he said with a rueful quality, "which I was aware was both inconvenient and rather extraordinary," she said. "I don't know what this looks like practically. I have land I'm going to and a life I'm building, and you have business in Pueblo and a home in Abilene." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to change your plans. I wouldn't ask that." "Then what are you asking?" He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to let whatever this is continue." "Continue," she said. "Yes." She thought about Boston and Gerald's careful, modest life and the years of low-grade dissatisfaction that she hadn't had words for. She thought about the Arkansas River crossing and the enormous sky and the journal entries that had gotten progressively harder to make factual and objective. "Yes," she said, "I'd be willing to let it continue." He reached across the space between them and took her hand in both of his, and held it with that careful, certain quality that he had when he was with his horses. And they sat by the fire while the Colorado stars performed their excessive, gorgeous display overhead, and Ruby Wainwright felt something in her chest that had been locked for a very long time come open. They reached the outskirts of Pueblo 2 days later, and the delivery of the horses to the rancher, a man named Harrison who lived on a sprawling spread to the north of the settlement and who greeted Jacob with the warmth of a long business relationship, took most of an afternoon. Ruby sat on the fence and watched Jacob work the horses through their paces for Harrison's benefit, demonstrating their gaits and responsiveness, and the rancher watched with the appreciation of someone who understood horses well, and she found herself watching both men and thinking that there was a specific kind of satisfaction in watching someone be genuinely good at what they do. Harrison invited them both to supper, and it was a better meal than they had eaten in 2 weeks, served by his wife, who was a forthright woman of 50 named Constance, who asked Ruby direct questions over the cornbread and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone who had been in this country long enough to find newcomers genuinely interesting rather than threatening. "You've got a parcel northwest of here," Constance Harrison said. "Creek land." "Allegedly," Ruby said. "I haven't seen it yet. I know most of the creek parcels in this valley," Constance said. "What's the deed number?" Ruby retrieved the deed from her bag and Constance looked at it and said, "Oh, that's the Whitfield parcel. That land is good. The creek's real. James Whitfield had it for 10 years before he went back east. The soil's deep and there's good grass for grazing. You're going to like it." Ruby sat with this information for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you. That is the first piece of genuinely positive practical information I have received about this land from anyone who actually knows what they're talking about." Constance Harrison smiled. "The railroad agents are enthusiastic men," she said. "Sometimes they're even accidentally right." Jacob caught her eye across the table, and the look they exchanged was the particular look of two people who are sharing a private understanding, and Constance Harrison noticed it and said nothing, but she was smiling into her cornbread. The following morning, Jacob arranged with Harrison to borrow a spare horse, and together he and Ruby rode out to find her land. It took the better part of a morning with directions from Harrison and Ruby's deed map spread across her saddle, and there was a moment, probably about a mile before they arrived, when the character of the land changed in a subtle way she felt before she saw, a greenness that was slightly richer, a quality to the air that was slightly cooler, and she pulled up her horse without quite meaning to. "We're close," Jacob said. "Yes," she said. She did not move for a moment, just sat on the borrowed horse on the hill and looked at the country ahead, and felt the weight of the past 3 years and the 20 years before them and the 3 weeks of travel and the morning she had decided in Gerald's empty study that she was going west, all of it pressing against the back of her eyes. "Ruby," Jacob said quietly. "I'm all right," she said. "Give me just a moment." He gave her the moment, which was exactly the right thing to do. Then she clicked her horse forward and they rode down toward the creek. It was real. The creek was real, running clear and cold from the mountains, and the land on either side of it was exactly what Constance Harrison had said: deep soil, good grass, a stand of cottonwood trees along the water that gave shade and shelter, the mountains visible to the west in a line of heartbreaking clarity. There was a structure, not much, a collapsed cabin that had been Whitfield's, but the foundations were stone and solid. Ruby dismounted and walked to the edge of the creek and stood in the cottonwood shade and listened to the water. She heard Jacob dismount behind her, and she heard his footsteps in the grass, and she did not turn around immediately. She was having something that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, somewhere in the territory between them that has no good name but that she recognized as the feeling of arriving somewhere that you had not known until this moment was home. He came to stand beside her, not touching, not speaking, just present. After a long moment she said, "It's right." "It is," he said. "The creek's real and the soil looks deep and the cabin foundation is stone." She turned to look at him. Her face was doing several things simultaneously. She was aware, and she no longer cared. "I came across an entire continent alone to get here, and everyone said I was brave." "You were brave," he said. "You also said I was right." "You were also right," he said. He was looking at her with an expression of such undefended warmth that she felt it like a hand pressed flat against her chest. "Both things can be true," she said. "Both things can be true," he agreed. She reached up and touched his face. The jaw with the scar she had been curious about for 2 weeks, the silver at his temple that she found unreasonably attractive. And he stood very still and let her. And then he put his hand over hers and turned his face slightly to press his lips against her palm, in the most careful and devastating thing she could remember happening to her in many years. "I don't have a plan for this part," she said with more honesty than grace. "Neither do I," he said with a warmth in his voice that suggested he was not particularly troubled by this. "I need to build something here," she said. "That's still true, that doesn't change." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't want it to, "But you live in Abilene." "I lived in Abilene," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him carefully. "Jacob, I have been thinking," he said, "about the fact that my work is portable. Horses exist everywhere. There is a significant and growing demand for good horses in Colorado territory. Harrison alone would take more horses than I can currently supply, and he knows every rancher in this valley," she said. "Are you suggesting that you could operate a horse trading business from a base in the Colorado territory?" "I'm suggesting that I could, yes," he said, "if there was reason to." "That's a significant decision," she said. "It is," he said. He looked at her with that level, amber-brown gaze that she had been slightly undone by since the first hour in the Abilene stable. "What I feel for you is not a small thing, Ruby. I'm not a person who says things they don't mean, and I am telling you that what has developed between us over the past 2 weeks is the most alive I have felt in 6 years. I'm not asking you to make any decisions you're not ready to make. I'm telling you that I'm not in a hurry to go back to a life that felt empty before I met you and will feel considerably emptier now." She was quiet for a long moment, holding his hand in both of hers, watching the creek. "Stay through the summer," she said finally. "Help me get the cabin rebuilt and the land assessed. We'll see how things stand at the end of it. That's all I need," he said. He stayed through the summer. He sent word back to Abilene to have his own stock 12 horses he kept at the livery shipped out by rail to the nearest stop and driven down by a young man he trusted, a Tejano hand named Ernesto, who arrived in early September with the horses in good shape and a grin that suggested he had heard something about the situation in Colorado. The cabin was rebuilt through August, with help from Harrison's ranch hands who had clearly been directed to assist, and Ruby suspected Constance Harrison of considerable useful interference in this regard, which she was entirely grateful for. The structure went up on the old stone foundation, 2 rooms, a proper chimney, a covered porch overlooking the creek, and Ruby designed it with the careful eye of someone who had been picturing a home in the West for years without knowing it. Jacob built the porch railing with a care that she found extremely touching, crafting the joints with a precision that was not strictly necessary for function, but that was clearly important to him. And she brought him coffee while he worked and sat on the uncompleted porch steps, and they talked about everything. His years in Ohio, her years in Boston, the specific texture of the grief of losing a spouse, and how it changed as time passed. The daughter Clara, who wrote letters with the reliability of a woman who had inherited her father's thoroughness. She wrote to Thomas in Vermont and described the land with the full warmth she felt for it, and described Jacob with a careful neutrality that she suspected Thomas would see through completely. And he wrote back in October with a letter that was mostly about the farm, but that ended with, "I am glad you found someone who understands that you were also right, and I hope you will let me know when I should plan to travel to Colorado for a wedding." Ruby read this letter at the kitchen table and said out loud to the empty room, "Thomas, you are extraordinary." Jacob appeared in the doorway, having been out checking on the horses. "Problem. My brother is apparently psychic," she said. He came in, leaving his boots at the door the way he had started doing naturally about 2 weeks in without anyone saying anything about it, and looked at the letter. She handed it to him. He read it, and the smile was immediate and genuine. "He seems like a good man," Jacob said. "He is the best man I know," she said, and then amended. "He was." Jacob looked at her. "He was the best man I know," she said. "He is now tied for that position." Jacob set the letter down carefully on the table and cupped her face in his hands with that particular gentleness that still, 3 months in, made her feel like she was being seen in the clearest possible light, and kissed her with a thoroughness that made her completely forget whatever she had been planning to do with the rest of the afternoon. The autumn settled over the creek land with a beauty that felt specifically designed to demonstrate what the right choice looked like in practice. The cottonwoods went gold and then copper. The creek stayed clear and cold. The grass dried to a color that was amber in the afternoon light that was approximately the same color as Jacob's eyes, which she mentioned to him, and which made him look slightly flustered and very pleased. The horses ranged in the east pasture. She had fenced it with Jacob over 3 weeks in September, which was an education in both fencing technique and the full range of Jacob's vocabulary when the post driver slipped, and she had started a garden in the sheltered space behind the cabin, thinking ahead to spring, turning the soil and working in the compost she had been building since August. She had also, after considerable thought and a long conversation with Constance Harrison, and one with a lawyer who visited Pueblo monthly from Denver, begun the process of establishing the land properly in her own name and understanding exactly what her rights were under Colorado territory law, which were not as comprehensive as she would have liked but were considerably better than they had been in some states, and she intended to hold every one of them firmly. Harrison had, as Jacob had anticipated, introduced him to every rancher in the valley, and he had already arranged 3 significant horse transactions for the spring, including one with a large cattle operation that needed working horses in quantity. He was running his business from the creek land, using one of the outbuildings he had repurposed into a proper stable with a small office, and the work suited him here in a way that seemed, she observed this carefully and tried to be objective about it, genuine and not performed. He was not making himself fit her life. He was finding his own shape within it. One evening in October, with the first real cold of the season in the air and the fire going properly for the first time, they were sitting in the 2 chairs she had bought from a furniture maker in Pueblo who had made them specifically to her specifications, which had apparently been an unusual enough request that the man had mentioned it to 2 other customers, and she said, "I want to ask you something directly." He set down the horse breeding record he had been reviewing. "All right." "Do you want to stay here?" she said. "Not as a temporary arrangement, not as a continuation of something that started on the trail, permanently. Do you want this to be where you live and build something?" He was quiet for a moment in the way he always was when he was genuinely considering something rather than formulating a polite answer. "When Clara was young," he said, "and my wife Margaret was alive, I had a very clear sense of what my life was for. It was for them. When Margaret died, I spent 6 years going through the motions because Clara needed me to, and then when she was married and didn't need me in the same way, I just continued going through the motions because I didn't know what else to do." He paused. "I've been here since July, 4 months. And I have had more sense of purpose and more genuine joy and more." He paused again, and she could see him choosing the words carefully, "more of a feeling that my life is actually my own than I have had in 6 years. And most of that is the work, which is good and growing, and some of it is this country, which I find I love, and all of it is you." "All of it is me," she repeated. "Without you I would not have come here and I would not have stayed and the work and the country would not have meant what they mean," he said. "So yes, to answer your question, I want to stay here permanently, and I want to ask you something in return." "Ask," she said. He said, "Ruby Wainwright, I know you came out here to start a life that was entirely your own, and I know what that cost you to decide, and I would never ask you to give that up or trade it for something smaller. What I'm asking is whether you would consider making it a life that is entirely ours. I am asking you to marry me, and I am doing so with the full understanding that this land is yours and your work on it is yours and your decisions about it are yours, and all I am bringing to the arrangement is myself, which I know is—" "Jacob," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. I have been waiting for you to ask since approximately the 3rd week on the trail, and I was trying very hard not to say so first because I was practicing being patient." He stared at her for a moment, and then he laughed, a full and genuine laugh that she had heard a few times and every time felt like something particularly wonderful. "Since the 3rd week," he said. "Since the 3rd week," she confirmed. He was across the room, and she was on her feet and his arms came around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and felt the solidity of him and the warmth of him, and the specific quality of rightness that she was fully prepared to call love. "We'll write to Clara," she said into his shoulder. "We will," he said. "And to Thomas," she said, "who is going to be absolutely insufferable about having predicted this." "I look forward to meeting him," Jacob said. She pulled back to look at him. "He'll come for the wedding. He'll probably bring half the Vermont farm with him by way of gifts." "The more the merrier," he said, and kissed her temple and then her cheek and then, with a deliberateness that she appreciated enormously, her mouth. They were married in February of 1874, at the small church in Pueblo that had been built the previous year, and whose minister, a young man named Reverend Cole, seemed genuinely pleased to be performing a wedding between two people who were clearly marrying each other because they wanted to, and not because they had to. Thomas came from Vermont, just as she had predicted, and he brought with him a collection of seeds for the garden and a quilt that their mother had made years ago, and that he had been keeping in a chest for a reason. He had apparently always known even when he didn't. He also brought his wife, a capable Vermonter named Agnes who had never been further west than Albany and who spent the entire journey, by her account, in a state of escalating wonder, and who upon seeing the creek land and the mountain said simply, "Oh, I understand now." Clara Donahue came from Kansas with her husband and their 18-month-old son, a round and energetic child named George who was deeply interested in the horses and required continuous herding away from the paddock. Clara was warm and direct, with her father's amber-brown eyes and a quality of clear-sighted assessment that Ruby recognized immediately as something she respected enormously. They sat together on the porch the evening before the wedding while the men were at the stable and the children were being managed by Agnes, and Clara said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," Ruby said. "My father has been—" Clara stopped and looked for the right words with a focus that was entirely Jacob's. "He has been going through his life for 6 years like a man going through the motions, being good at the work and being kind and being responsible and being nothing else. When I got his letter in July, there was something different in it. I read it and I said to my husband, something has happened to my father, something real." She looked at Ruby. "He is different with you. He is himself again, or maybe himself in a way he hasn't been before, and I wanted you to know that I can see it clearly and I am grateful for it." Ruby was quiet for a moment. The creak was audible from the porch as it always was, a constant low conversation. "He gave me the same thing," Ruby said, "in case you were concerned about the equation being uneven." Clara smiled, and it was her father's smile, and Ruby thought that she was getting a family in this deal, which she had not quite anticipated but found she was entirely prepared for. The wedding was small and warm, and Reverend Cole made it brief enough that it didn't feel like a performance and long enough that it felt like a commitment. And when Jacob took both her hands in his at the altar and looked at her, she looked back at him with everything she had: the 40 years and the 20 years of invisibility, and the 3 years of deciding, and the 7 months of crossing a continent, and finding a piece of land, and building a home and falling in love. All of it in her face without apology, and his grip on her hands tightened slightly. "I do," he said when asked, with a simplicity that held everything. "I do," she said with the same. The reception was dinner at the Harrison Ranch, because Constance Harrison had clearly been waiting for an occasion of exactly this kind, and the food was extraordinary, and the company was warm, and Thomas gave a toast that was funny and loving and made Ruby cry for the good reasons. And Constance Harrison said something in her ear that she kept for herself, and Clara Donahue danced with her husband while George slept on a bench under Agnes's attentive eye. And Jacob danced with Ruby for the first time to the music of a fiddle player Harrison had brought in from town, and he was not a particularly graceful dancer, but he held her with such careful, deliberate warmth that it did not matter. "We should dance more often," she said. "We should," he agreed. "I'll practice." "Please don't," she said. "I find your complete lack of self-consciousness about it rather charming." He spun her in what was technically a turn and looked so pleased with himself that she laughed and stayed laughing for the rest of the song. Thomas and Agnes stayed a full week, and Thomas walked every inch of the creek land with Jacob and asked intelligent questions about the horses and the soil and the Colorado Territory in general. And Jacob answered with the same seriousness he brought to everything, and Ruby watched them from the porch one afternoon and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as peace. Thomas sat with her alone their last evening, while Jacob was doing the last stable check of the day. "You did it," Thomas said. "It was simple and it was everything." "I did it," she agreed. "You were right," he said. "Several people have now confirmed that," she said and smiled. He put his arm around her shoulders the way he had when they were children on the Vermont farm, the two of them looking at something together from a shared height. "Mother would have been fierce and proud," he said. "She would have been absolutely beside herself," Ruby said. "She'd have been out here the day after Gerald died if she'd lived." "She would have built a better cabin than you did in half the time," Thomas said. "The cabin is excellent," Ruby said firmly, and Thomas laughed. Spring came to the creek land, with an extravagance that felt entirely unnecessary and entirely welcome. The garden Ruby had planted in the fall came up, the bulbs she had put in under Thomas's Vermont advice, the seeds she had started in a window box she had built in February, the kitchen garden that was already showing green rows of promise. The horses in the east pasture had gotten through the winter well, and Jacob was anticipating the first of his spring deliveries, which would establish his reputation in the valley in a way that mattered for the business. There was also, and she told Jacob on a Tuesday morning in April while he was eating breakfast, and managed to say it with complete calm while her heart was doing the theatrical thing again, the fact that she was fairly certain she was pregnant. He sat for a long moment with his coffee cup held still in his hands and looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something entirely open and vulnerable and joy-stricken all at once. "Ruby," he said. "I know," she said. "I was not expecting this to be part of the plan. I'm 40 years old. It may be there may be complications. I'm being clear-eyed about it." "I know you are," he said. He stood up and came around the table, and she stood too, and he held her face in his hands the way he did when he was trying to say something that words were not quite large enough for. "Are you happy about it?" She considered this with genuine care. She was 40 years old. She was building a life she had chosen. She was married to a man she loved with a completeness that still occasionally surprised her. She was standing in a kitchen she had designed, in a house she had helped build, on land she had crossed an entire continent to reach. "I am very happy about it," she said. He kissed her forehead and her cheeks and then held her against him, and she could feel him breathing, and outside the kitchen window the creek was audible and the mountains were visible above the cottonwoods and the garden was coming up. She wrote to Thomas that same week, and his reply came in June, a letter that was short enough that she suspected he was too emotional to write more, ending with, "I will be there in August, ready to meet whoever arrives first." Constance Harrison, when told, said, "I'll come when you need me," in the tone of someone who had attended many such occasions and knew exactly what she was offering. Ruby took her hand and said, "Thank you," and meant it in more ways than she could list. The summer of 1874 was hot and green and full, and Ruby gardened through it with increasing awkwardness and decreasing patience for her own physical limitations, which she managed by reminding herself that she had crossed a continent alone at 40, and if she could do that she could certainly manage a garden in July. Jacob was attentive without being hovering, which was precisely the right calibration. He brought things she didn't ask for because he had thought ahead, and he did not treat her as fragile, which she was not, but he also made sure the water bucket was never empty, and that there was always kindling cut, and that the chair on the porch had a footrest, which appeared one day without discussion. Clara came in August, without the husband but with George, who was now 2 and in possession of opinions about everything, and Thomas and Agnes came from Vermont 3 weeks before Ruby's expected time, and the creek land was full in a way that felt right rather than crowded. The boy arrived in September. He was large and loud from the first moment, with dark hair that was clearly his father's and eyes that were still the newborn blue that might become amber or might become the dark green-brown of his mother's. No one could yet say. Constance Harrison was there, steady and experienced and exactly what was needed. And when it was over and Ruby was holding her son for the first time, she looked down at this person who had not existed in the world before and felt the full measure of something she did not have a word for and did not need one. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife, and the expression on his face was one she intended to remember for the rest of her life. "What do we name him?" she said, because they had discussed several options without settling, and she had privately thought they would know when they saw him. "You choose," Jacob said. She looked at the baby. "William Thomas Winslow," she said. Jacob looked at her. "For your brother." "For my brother," she said. "He deserves it." Thomas, when informed in the doorway, turned and walked back down the hall and out onto the porch, and Agnes followed him. And through the window Ruby could see him standing at the porch railing looking at the creek with a quality of stillness that told her everything she needed to know. Clara held her half-brother with the practiced ease of a mother and said, "He's going to be enormous." "He already is," Ruby said. George stood in the doorway and looked at the baby with deep suspicion, and then said, with the clarity of a 2-year-old, "Horse," which made everyone laugh, and the baby blinked at the sudden noise with an expression of profound bewilderment. The autumn came again to the creek land with its cottonwood gold and its mountain clarity, and William Thomas Winslow grew with the vigorous determination of a person who has a great deal of world to engage with and no patience for doing so slowly. He was dark-haired and loud and intensely interested in everything, particularly the horses, which Ruby had not been surprised by, and he was held with equal enthusiasm by Constance Harrison and by Ernesto, who had stayed on as Jacob's chief hand, and who appeared to regard the baby as personally his to educate about horses. Thomas and Agnes had gone back to Vermont with a promise to return in the spring, and Thomas had written 3 letters already with questions about the baby that were scientifically thorough and clearly written, by someone who was trying not to admit how badly they wanted to come back immediately. One evening in October, Ruby and Jacob sat on the porch with the baby sleeping on Jacob's chest in a way that made the lamplight fall on both their faces, and the mountains were darkening against the copper sky, and the creek was talking to itself the way it always did. And she thought about the platform in Boston 11 months ago, and the rotted board her heel had gone through, and the long train journey and the enormous Kansas sky, and the Arkansas River crossing, and the first sight of this land, and the specific quality of rightness she had felt standing by the creek for the first time. "You know what people were still saying when Thomas left," she said. "That you were brave," Jacob said. "That I was brave," she confirmed. "Agnes told me that their neighbor Mrs. Fletcher told Thomas he should have stopped me, that it was not right for a woman to do such a thing." Jacob was quiet, running one hand in slow circles on William's back. "And Thomas said," he prompted. Thomas told her that his sister had crossed an entire continent alone at 40 years old, and built a home in Colorado Territory and started a business, and married a good man and had a son, and that the only possible judgment any reasonable person could make about all of that was that she had been absolutely right. She paused. He said it was the clearest example of a person being right that he had seen in 50 years of living. Jacob turned his head to look at her, and William shifted slightly and made a small sound and settled back into sleep, and the amber light was on his face, and the mountains were dark behind him, and the creek was steady, and the stars were beginning, and she thought, all of this is the answer to every question about whether the decision was right. "Thomas is right about that," Jacob said. "Everyone said I was brave," she said. "You were brave," he said, "and you were also right." "Both things at once," she said. "Both things at once," he agreed. She moved her chair closer to his so that her shoulder was against his arm and her hand was on his knee, and he leaned his head briefly against hers, carefully, so as not to disturb the sleeping baby, and they watched the last light leave the Colorado sky together. The winter that followed was the first Ruby spent in the West, and it was harder than she had anticipated and more beautiful than she had imagined. The snow came in November and covered the creek land in a silence that was extraordinary after the years of city noise, and the mountains turned white above the frosted cottonwoods, and the work of keeping the animals through the cold months was considerable but satisfying in a way that connected her to the Vermont farm of her childhood in a line that felt clean and right. William was a vigorous baby who regarded the snow outside the window with the specific outrage of someone who wants to reach a thing he cannot yet reach, and Jacob spent the long winter evenings working on horse breeding records and correspondence, while Ruby nursed the baby and read. She had sent for books from a Denver bookseller, a substantial order that had arrived in October, and she was working through them with the happiness of someone who had been without enough to read for too long. They talked in the evenings with the easy fluency of two people who have found the particular frequency on which they communicate without effort. They talked about the horses and the garden plans for spring, and about Clara's news. She was expecting again, which meant William would have a cousin arriving next summer, and about Thomas's letters, and about the territory news, and about ideas, because they were both people who had a great deal of opinions about things and had found in each other someone who could receive those opinions with genuine interest. Jacob had a particular way of listening fully, without the half-attention that most people gave to conversation, and she had a particular way of asking questions that made him examine his own thoughts more carefully than he usually did, and the combination meant that their conversations regularly surprised her with where they ended up. One February evening, when William was asleep and the fire was high and the snow was on the ground outside and the night was very quiet, she said, "I want to tell you something." He looked up from his records. "When I was sitting in Gerald's study the morning after the funeral," she said, "sorting through his things, I found the land deed in his desk. He had never mentioned it to me. He had bought it speculating as a financial instrument and put it in his desk and forgotten about it. And when I found it, I sat there for a very long time looking at it, and I had this feeling." She paused, reaching for the right words. "I had the feeling that it was pointing at something. Not just the land, but a direction. A way out of the life I was in, which was not a bad life and was not unhappy exactly, but was small," he said. "Small," she agreed. "Smaller than me. And I sat with that deed for about 2 hours, and I wrote a letter to the land office to verify it was valid, and I got up and made dinner and didn't say anything to anyone for 3 months, and then one morning I just started telling people." "That you were going," he said. "That I was going," she said. "And everyone said I was brave, and that was both kind and not quite right, and the only person who ever got it right was my brother Thomas, who said I should have gone years ago, and then you, who said I was also right." He set down his papers and looked at her with complete attention. "I want you to know," she said, "that the moment you said that not just brave but right was the moment I knew." "Knew what?" "That whatever happened on that journey and wherever I ended up, I was not going to be small anymore," she said. "And when you said it, I also knew, I think I knew then, on the 9th day of the journey, that I wanted you to be part of the life that was not small." He was across the room to her in a way that was immediate and direct, crouching before her chair and taking her hands, and the firelight was warm on both of them, and William was asleep in his cradle, and the snow was on the Colorado mountains, and the creek was running under its ice toward wherever creeks went in winter. "Ruby Wainwright," he said. "Ruby Winslow," she corrected, with a warmth in it. He pressed his lips to her hands, both of them, knuckle by knuckle. "Ruby Winslow," he said, with a reverence that she felt in every part of herself. In the spring, Thomas wrote to say that Agnes was expecting, not their first, but the first in years, and they were both astonished and delighted, and the letter had an overflow of happiness in it that made Ruby feel simultaneously far from Vermont and entirely connected to it. She wrote back at length and sent seeds from her garden that she thought Agnes would use, and a carved toy she had commissioned from the furniture maker in Pueblo for the coming child. Clara's second baby came in July, a girl this time, named Margaret after her grandmother, which made Jacob cry in the privacy of their bedroom in a way that Ruby held without saying anything, because some things do not need words. George had apparently greeted his sister with the same deep suspicion he had applied to William, which seemed to be his general policy on new arrivals, and they all expected he would come around in time. Summer on the Creek land was its full self. The garden was extraordinary that year, the beans particularly, and the horses were thriving, and Jacob had established himself firmly enough in the valley that his name was known as far as Denver, and two significant ranching operations had approached him about ongoing supply contracts that would make the business stable in a way that was deeply satisfying. Ruby had also, quietly and carefully, begun something she had been thinking about since the previous winter. She had noticed that the women in the settlements around Pueblo had limited access to certain practical things, medical information, basic legal information about their rights as property owners, information about farming and land management. And she had begun writing a series of practical pamphlets that she sent to the newspaper in Pueblo, who published them under her name without comment. And the response had been significant enough that she was now receiving letters from women across the territory with questions she was doing her best to answer. Jacob found her one evening surrounded by letters and in the middle of a long response to a woman in northern Colorado who was trying to understand her rights to her homestead after her husband's death. "You're building something else," he said, looking at the papers. "I'm answering questions," she said. "I had the same questions 3 years ago and no one answered them clearly. The least I can do is answer them for someone else." "It's more than answering questions," he said. "You're establishing something." She looked at the letters and the pamphlets and the pages of careful response. "I suppose I am," she said. He leaned in the doorway with that quality of calm satisfaction she had learned to read as the expression of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. "It suits you," he said. "Most things suit me now," she said honestly. He smiled, the full smile she had fallen in love with on the trail, the one that transformed his face, and pushed off the doorway and came to look over her shoulder at the letter she was writing. And she felt his presence behind her the way she always did, warm and certain and exactly right. By autumn of 1875, William was a year old and already pulling himself up on the porch railing and looking at the horses with an intensity that Jacob said was early evidence of a vocation. Clara visited in September with George and baby Margaret, and the creek land was full of children and horses and the particular comfortable noise of a place that has become thoroughly itself. They sat on the porch one evening, Clara and Ruby, with the children put to bed and the men at the stable going over something horse-related with the focus of two people who enjoy each other's company and have found a shared language, and Clara said, "He's happy." "I know," Ruby said. "I haven't seen him like this since before my mother died," Clara said. "I want you to know that I know what you gave him." "He gave me the same," Ruby said. Clara looked out at the mountains, dark against the late September sky. "I used to worry after Mother died that he would just continue, just keep going through the days without really being in them." She paused. "I used to lie awake thinking about it. A person can do that for years, you know, just going through. It looks like living from the outside." "I know," Ruby said, thinking of her own years in Boston. "And then you came along," Clara said, "and you needed a ride to Colorado." Ruby laughed. "I needed a ride to Colorado," she agreed. "I told George," Clara said, "when he's old enough to understand, I'm going to tell him that his grandfather found his grandmother because she needed a ride to Colorado, and she crossed a whole continent alone to get there." "That's not quite how the sequence worked," Ruby said. "It's close enough," Clara said, and grinned in a way that was entirely her father's. The letter that came from Thomas in November contained, among other news, a small and precise line that Ruby read 3 times. "Agnes delivered in October. A boy. We've named him Samuel Gerald, the second name for your Gerald, because he was a decent man, and he bought a piece of land that sent you west, and that seems worth remembering." She set the letter down and sat with it for a while, and felt the full and complicated gratitude of a person who has arrived somewhere good by an unexpected road, and who is able now to see the full length of the road behind them without bitterness. When Jacob came in for supper, she showed him the letter. He read it, and then he looked at her with those amber-brown eyes that she still, more than 2 years in, sometimes lost a whole sentence to, and he said, "Gerald bought the land. Gerald bought the land," she said. "You came to it. I came to it. And here we are," he said simply. "Here we are," she said. She picked up her coffee and looked out the window at the creek and the cottonwoods and the mountains, and the evening light was on all of it in the specific way it had in autumn when the angle of the sun turned everything to copper and amber. The settlement around Pueblo grew through 1875 and into 1876, and with it, the texture of life on the creek land changed in small ways. There were more neighbors, more trade. The road to town was better maintained. A school was established that would eventually be relevant to William and to whatever other children might arrive in time. The railroad was coming, everyone said, and when it did, the territory would change more dramatically still. Ruby watched these changes with the clear eyes of someone who had no illusions about progress being straightforward or costless. She knew enough of the history of this land, the Ute people who had been here for centuries, the successive waves of newcomers each claiming the country as though it had been empty before them, to know that the territory's future was being written in ways that were not always just. She said so in print, occasionally, in the newspaper pieces she continued to write, and some people agreed with her and some people did not, and she had never in her life had any interest in adjusting what she said publicly to please people who did not want to hear it. Jacob read everything she published before she sent it. He was not a man who agreed with her on every point. They had substantive arguments, occasionally significant ones, which they worked through with the same practical directness they brought to everything else, and which generally ended with both of them having been somewhat revised by the encounter. He disagreed with her about something in one particular piece and said so clearly, and she revised her thinking on that point with the honesty of someone who had a higher loyalty to accuracy than to being right, and she told him that his point had changed her mind, and he said, "That's the most terrifying and wonderful thing you've ever said to me," and she laughed. William took his first independent steps in February of 1876, across the kitchen floor toward the back door, clearly attempting to reach the horses, which everyone agreed was entirely predictable and entirely perfect. He was in all outward respects his father's son, the dark hair, the deliberate quality, the way he looked at things before he engaged with them. But the stubbornness and the clear green-brown eyes were Ruby's, and the combination was already formidable at 16 months and promised to be impressive by adulthood. Thomas visited again in the spring of 1876, this time with Agnes and young Samuel, who was 6 months old and placid in the way that William had never been. Thomas walked the land again and said it was even better than he had remembered, and Agnes sat in the garden with the baby and said she was never going back to Vermont, and Thomas said they most certainly were, and Agnes said this without heat and enormous affection, and Ruby watched them and felt a warmth that was both love and relief, that the people she loved most in the world were well, and that the distance had not eroded what mattered. One morning Thomas and Ruby walked the creek line alone, as they sometimes had as children on the Vermont farm, side by side in a comfortable quiet that had a lifetime in it. "You look like yourself," Thomas said. "I mean properly like yourself. Like the version of you that existed before you learned to take up less space." "I learned late," she said. "I was 40. Better late than never," he said, "and some people never manage it at all." She thought about that for a while, walking along the creek with the water cold and clear beside them and the mountains ahead. "Everyone still says I was brave," she said. "New people, when they hear the story, they say, 'What a brave woman.'" "And you're still annoyed by it," Thomas said. less annoyed, she said. I understand what they mean. It does take something to do what I did. I'm not dismissing that. But bravery implies overcoming fear, and fear implies doubt, and I didn't doubt. I was frightened sometimes, and I was uncertain about the specific logistics, but I never doubted that it was right. Because it was right, Thomas said. Because it was right, she said. He stopped and looked at the mountains. I'll tell you something I've never told you, he said. After Gerald died and you came to Vermont for the month and we walked the farm every day, I could see it happening. I could see you waking up. Like a person who has been in a dim room for a long time and then someone opens the shutters. He paused. I wanted to say then go, just go, but I thought it had to come from you. It did come from me, she said. It did, he said. I just watched. She put her arm through his the way she had when they were young, leaning against him slightly. You were also right, she said. He laughed. Jacob said that. Jacob says a great deal of things that are exactly right, she said. Thomas looked sideways at her with the expression of an older brother who has been vindicated in every possible way. I like him enormously, he said. I know, she said. The feeling is entirely mutual. They turned back toward the cabin, and the morning was clear and the creek was bright and the cottonwoods were in new leaf. A green so fresh it almost hurt, and ahead of them the cabin showed its solid stone foundation, and its covered porch and the smoke rising from the chimney where Agnes was undoubtedly making the excellent coffee she had brought from Vermont. And the sound of a child moving around inside could be heard, and the horses were in the east paddock, and it was, she thought, precisely what she had chosen, and precisely what she had been right to choose. That evening they all sat on the porch together, Thomas and Agnes and Ruby and Jacob, with William asleep inside and young Samuel milk-sated and drowsy in Agnes's arms, and they talked in the easy way of people who have no performance to give each other, and the mountains turned dark against the stars, and the creek said the same thing it always said. Jacob's hand found hers in the space between their chairs, and she turned hers over and held it, and did not look at him because she didn't need to. You know, Agnes said at some point, when Thomas first told me you had gone west alone, I thought that is either the bravest or the most foolhardy thing I've ever heard. Nearly everyone thought that, Ruby said. But then I saw his face when he talked about it, Agnes said, meaning Thomas, and I thought no, she knows something the rest of us don't know yet. Ruby was quiet for a moment. I didn't know anything, she said. I just decided and then I went. The knowing came after. That's how it usually works, Constance Harrison said, from the end of the porch, where she had arrived at supper time as she occasionally did when she happened to be passing, which was often enough that Ruby had set aside a chair specifically for her. The knowing comes after the going. There's a piece of writing in that, Jacob said, looking at Ruby. There is, she said. I'll get to it. She did get to it. She wrote it that winter, the winter of 1876, in a piece that was longer than her usual work, published in the Pueblo paper and then reprinted. She was told, in 2 Denver papers and eventually in a women's journal in Chicago. She wrote about the decision and the journey and the land and what she had found and built. She wrote about being called brave and what was right and what was missing from that word, the part that was about decision and certainty, and the specific quality of knowing, even in the absence of evidence, that something is right. She did not write about Jacob, or not directly, but she wrote, I found in the course of the journey that the country was full of people who could see clearly, who could look at a situation and describe it without the distortions of convention. The West, for all its difficulties and its injustices and its considerable danger, had produced or attracted people who had a direct relationship with reality, and one of those people, on the 9th day of my journey, said something to me that I had been waiting to hear my entire adult life. He said I was not only brave, he said I was also right. And I want every woman sitting in a dim room, feeling a low hum of dissatisfaction she cannot name, to know that those words are available to her too, that she can be right. That the wanting and the going and the arriving, all of it is available, and the country is large, and the sky is enormous, and the creek is real. Jacob read this at the kitchen table on a January evening with William on his lap trying to reach the paper. He read it twice. Then he looked up at her with those amber eyes in the lamplight. "Ruby," he said. "Don't," she said. "I'm not going to say anything maudlin," he said. "Good," she said. "I'm just going to say," he said, "that I am extremely glad you needed a horse and a wagon in Abilene in the summer of 1873. She laughed. "I was specifically glad about the man they came with," she said. William grabbed the paper with both hands and expressed his opinion of journalism in the way of all 18-month-olds. And the moment dissolved into the logistics of rescuing the page and settling the child. And then Jacob kissed her, while William was distracted by a wooden horse Ernesto had carved for him. And it was the kiss of a man who meant it, and had always meant it, and intended to keep meaning it for a very long time. The creek ran outside and the mountains stood in the winter dark, and William Winslow played with his wooden horse on the kitchen floor, and Ruby and Jacob Winslow, who had found each other at the exact moment, and in the exact place that made everything that followed possible, sat together in the warm room they had built on a piece of land she had chosen and he had come to, both of them right, both of them home. In the spring of 1877, when the cottonwoods were new-leafed again, and the garden was planted, and the horses were fat on the good creek grass, and William was running everywhere at a speed that required continuous attention and showed absolutely no signs of moderation, Ruby discovered that there was going to be another child. She was 43 years old, and the knowledge settled over her with the same quality of rightness that this land had always had, as though the life she was living had its own momentum now, its own generosity, its own abundance. She told Jacob in the evening, sitting on the porch, and he looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the mountains, and then he looked back at her with everything in his face. "We are," she said, "going to need to make the cabin bigger." "I'll start drawing plans," he said, without missing a beat. She loved him, she thought, with the full and uncomplicated certainty of someone who has passed the point of uncertainty and arrived somewhere permanent. She loved him with the love that is possible only when two people have had enough life to know what they are choosing and choose it anyway, deliberately, with open eyes. "Jacob," she said. "Ruby," he said, "I want to tell you something." He waited. "I crossed an entire continent alone at 40 years old," she said, "and everyone who heard about it said I was brave, which was kind of them and not entirely right." "I said you were also right," he said. "You said I was also right," she agreed. "And you have continued to say so in various ways every day since the 9th day of that journey, and I want you to know that it remains the most important thing anyone has ever said to me." He reached across and took her hand, and they sat in the Colorado evening with the creek talking and the mountains standing watch and William's small sounds audible through the cabin wall, and the second child growing toward a spring arrival, and the horses in the east pasture, and the garden coming up for the 3rd year, and the life fully itself in every direction. "You were brave," he said. "And I was also right," she said. "Both things at once," he said. "Both things at once," she agreed, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and watched the first stars appear over the mountains that she had come across an entire continent to see, and felt, with a completeness that had no edge and no qualification, the full and perfect weight of having been exactly right.